Chapter 25 of The Alaskan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Roger Moline. The Alaskan by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 25. That in the lust and passion of his designs and the arrogance of his power, John Graham was not afraid to overstep all law and order, and that he believed Holt would shelter Mary Standish from injury and death, there could no longer be a doubt after the first few swift moments following Sokwenna's rifle shots from the attic window. Through the window of the lower room, barricaded by the cautious old warrior until its aperture was not more than 8 inches square, Alan thrust his rifle as the crash of gunfire broke the gray and thickening mist of night. He could hear the thud and hiss of bullets. He heard them singing like angry bees as they passed with the swiftness of chain lightning over the cabin roof, and their patter against the log walls was like the hollow drumming of knuckles against the side of a ripe watermelon. There was something fascinating and almost gentle about that last sound. It did not seem that the horror of death was riding with it, and Alan lost all sense of fear as he stared in the direction from which the firing came, trying to make out shadows at which to shoot. Here and there he saw dim, white streaks, and at these he fired as fast as he could throw cartridges into the chamber and pull the trigger. Then he crouched down with the empty gun. It was Mary Standish who held out a freshly loaded weapon to him. Her face was waxen in its deathly pallor. Her eyes, staring at him so strangely, never for an instant leaving his face, were lustrous with the agony of fear that flamed in their depths. She was not afraid for herself. It was for him. His name was on her lips, a whisper unspoken, a breathless prayer, and in that instant a bullet sped through the opening in front of which he had stood a moment before. A hissing, writhing serpent of death that struck something behind them in its venomous wrath. With a cry she flung up her arms about his bent head. "My God, they will kill you if you stand there," she moaned. "Give me up to them, Alan. If you love me, give me up." A sudden spurt of white dust shot out into the dim candle glow, and then another, so near Nawadlook that his blood went cold. Bullets were finding their way through the moss and earth chinking between the logs of the cabin. His arms closed in a fierce embrace about the girl's slim body, and before she could realize what was happening, he leaped to the trap with her and almost flung her into its protection. Then he forced Nawadlook down beside her, and after them he thrust in the empty gun and the apron with its weight of cartridges. His face was demonic in its command. "If you don't stay there, I'll open the door and go outside to fight. Do you understand? Stay there!" His clenched fist was in their faces, his voice almost a shout. He saw another white spurt of dust. The bullet crashed in tinware, and following the crash came a shriek from Keok in the attic. In that upper gloom Sokwenna's gun had fallen with a clatter. The old warrior bent himself over, nearly double, and with his 2 withered hands was clutching his stomach. He was on his knees, and his breath suddenly came in a panting, gasping cry. Then he straightened slowly and said something reassuring to Keok, and faced the window again with the gun which she had loaded for him. The scream had scarcely gone from Keok's lips when Alan was at the top of the ladder, calling her. She came to him through the stark blackness of the room, sobbing that Sokwenna was hit, and Alan reached out and seized her and dragged her down and placed her with Nawadlook and Mary Standish. From them he turned to the window, and his soul cried out madly for the power to see, to kill, to avenge. As if in answer to this prayer for light and vision, he saw his cabin strangely illuminated. Dancing, yellow radiance silhouetted the windows, and a stream of it billowed out through an open door into the night. It was so bright he could see the rain mist, scarcely heavier than a dense, slowly descending fog, a wet blanket of vapor moistening the earth. His heart jumped as with each second the blaze of light increased. They had set fire to his cabin. They were no longer white men, but savages. He was terribly cool, even as his heart throbbed so violently. He watched with the eyes of a deadly hunter, wide open over his rifle barrel. Sokwenna was still. Probably he was dead. Keok was sobbing in the cellar pit. Then he saw a shape growing in the illumination, 3 or 4 of them, moving, alive. He waited until they were clearer, and he knew what they were thinking, that the bullet-riddled cabin had lost its power to fight. He prayed God it was Graham he was aiming at, and fired. The figure went down, sank into the earth as a dead man falls. Steadily he fired at the others. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 2 out of the 4 he hit, and the exultant thought flashed upon him that it was good shooting under the circumstances. He sprang back for another gun, and it was Mary who was waiting for him, head and shoulders out of the cellar pit, the rifle in her hands. She was sobbing as she looked straight at him, yet without moisture or tears in her eyes. "Keep down," he warned. "Keep down below the floor." He guessed what was coming. He had shown his enemies that life still existed in the cabin, life with death in its hands, and now, from the shelter of the other cabins, from the darkness, from beyond the light of his flaming home, the rifle fire continued to grow until it filled the night with a horrible din. He flung himself face down upon the floor so that the lower log of the building protected him. No living thing could have stood up against what was happening in these moments. Bullets tore through the windows and between the moss-chinked logs, crashing against metal and glass and tinware. One of the candles sputtered and went out, and in this hell Alan heard a cry and saw Mary Standish coming out of the cellar pit toward him. He had flung himself down quickly, and she thought he was hit. He shrieked at her, and his heart froze with horror as he saw a heavy tress of her hair drop to the floor as she stood there in that frightful moment, white and glorious in the face of the gunfire. Before she could move another step, he was at her side, and with her in his arms leaped into the pit. A bullet sang over them. He crushed her so close that for a breath or two life seemed to leave her body. A sudden draught of cool air struck his face. He missed Nawadlook. In the deeper gloom farther under the floor he heard her moving and saw a faint square of light. She was creeping back. Her hands touched his arm. "We can get away. There!" she cried in a low voice. "I have opened the little door. We can crawl through it and into the ravine." Her words and the square of light were an inspiration. He had not dreamed that Graham would turn the cabin into a death hole, and Nawadlook's words filled him with a sudden thrilling hope. The rifle fire was dying away again as he gave voice to his plan in sharp, swift words. He would hold the cabin. As long as he was there, Graham and his men would not dare to rush it. At least they would hesitate a considerable time before doing that. And meanwhile the girls could steal down into the ravine. There was no one on that side to intercept them, and both Keok and Nawadlook were well acquainted with the trails into the mountains. It would mean safety for them. He would remain in the cabin and fight until Stampede Smith and the herdsmen came. The white face against his breast was cold and almost expressionless. Something in it frightened him. He knew his argument had failed and that Mary Standish would not go, yet she did not answer him, nor did her lips move in the effort. "Go, for their sakes, if not for your own and mine," he insisted, holding her away from him. "Good God, think what it would mean if beasts like those out there get hold of Keok and Nawadlook. Graham is your husband and will protect you for himself, but for them there will be no hope, no salvation, nothing but a fate more terrible than death. They will be like 2 beautiful lambs thrown among wolves, broken, destroyed." Her eyes were burning with horror. Keok was sobbing, and a moan which she bravely tried to smother in her breast came from Nawadlook. "And you?" whispered Mary. "I must remain here. It is the only way." Dumbly she allowed him to lead her back with Keok and Nawadlook. Keok went through the opening first, then Nawadlook, and Mary Standish last. She did not touch him again. She made no movement toward him and said no word, and all he remembered of her when she was gone in the gloom was her eyes. In that last look she had given him her soul, and no whisper, no farewell caress came with it. "Go cautiously until you are out of the ravine, then hurry toward the mountains," were his last words. He saw their forms fade into dim shadows, and the gray mist swallowed them. He hurried back, seized a loaded gun, and sprang to the window, knowing that he must continue to deal death until he was killed. Only in that way could he hold Graham back and give those who had escaped a chance for their lives. Cautiously he looked out over his gun barrel. His cabin was a furnace red with flame. Streams of fire were licking out at the windows and through the door, and as he sought vainly for a movement of life, the crackling roar of it came to his ears, and so swiftly that his breath choked him. The pitch-filled walls became sheets of conflagration until the cabin was a seething, red-hot torch of fire whose illumination was more dazzling than the sun of day. Out into this illumination suddenly stalked a figure waving a white sheet at the end of a long pole. It advanced slowly, a little hesitatingly at first, as if doubtful of what might happen, and then it stopped, full in the light, an easy mark for a rifle aimed from Sokwenna's cabin. He saw who it was then, and drew in his rifle and watched the unexpected maneuver in amazement. The man was Rossland. In spite of the dramatic tenseness of the moment, Alan could not repress the grim smile that came to his lips. Rossland was a man of illogical resource, he meditated. Only a short time ago he had fled ignominiously through fear of personal violence, while now, with a courage that could not fail to rouse admiration, he was exposing himself to a swift and sudden death, protected only by the symbol of truce over his head. That he owed this symbol either regard or honor did not for an instant possess Alan. A murderer held it, a man even more vile than a murderer if such a creature existed on earth, and for such a man death was a righteous end. Only Rossland's nerve, and what he might have to say, held back the vengeance within reach of Alan's hand. He waited, and Rossland again advanced and did not stop until he was within 100 feet of the cabin. A sudden, disturbing thought flashed upon Alan as he heard his name called. He had seen no other figures, no other shadows beyond Rossland, and the burning cabin now clearly illuminated the windows of Sokwenna's place. Was it conceivable that Rossland was merely a lure, and the instant he exposed himself in a parley of score of hidden rifles would reveal their treachery? He shuddered and held himself below the opening of the window. Graham and his men were more than capable of such a crime. Rossland's voice rose above the crackle and roar of the burning cabin. "Alan Holt, are you there?" "Yes, I am here," shouted Alan. "And I have a line on your heart, Rossland, and my finger is on the trigger. What do you want?" There was a moment of silence, as if the thought of what he was facing had at last stricken Rossland dumb. Then he said, "We are giving you a last chance, Holt. For God's sake, don't be a fool. The offer I made you today is still good. If you don't accept it, the law must take its course." "The law!" Alan's voice was a savage cry. "Yes, the law. The law is with us. We have the proper authority to recover a stolen wife, a captive, a prisoner held in restraint with felonious intent. But we don't want to press the law unless we are forced to do so. You and the old Eskimo have killed 3 of our men and wounded 2 others. That means the hangman if we take you alive. But we are willing to forget that if you will accept the offer I made you today. What do you say?" Alan was stunned. Speech failed him as he realized the monstrous assurance with which Graham and Rossland were playing their game. And when he made no answer, Rossland continued to drive home his arguments, believing that at last Alan was at the point of surrender. Up in the dark attic the voices had come like ghostland whispers to old Sokwenna. He lay huddled at the window, and the chill of death was creeping over him. But the voices roused him. They were not strange voices, but voices which came up out of the past of many years ago, calling upon him, urging him, persisting in his ears with cries of vengeance and of triumph, the call of familiar names, a moaning of women, a sobbing of children. Shadowy hands helped him, and a last time he raised himself to the window, and his eyes were filled with the glare of the burning cabin. He struggled to lift his rifle, and behind him he heard the exultation of his people as he rested it over the sill, and with gasping breath leveled it at something which moved between him and the blazing light of that wonderful sun which was the burning cabin. And then, slowly and with difficulty, he pressed the trigger, and Sokwenna's last shot sped on its mission. At the sound of the shot, Alan looked through the window. For a moment Rossland stood motionless. Then the pole in his hands wavered, drooped, and fell to the earth, and Rossland sank down after it, making no sound, and lay a dark and huddled blot on the ground. The appalling swiftness and ease with which Rossland had passed from life into death shocked every nerve in Alan's body. Horror for a brief space stupefied him, and he continued to stare at the dark and motionless blot, forgetful of his own danger, while a grim and terrible silence followed the shot. And then what seemed to be a single cry broke that silence, though it was made up of many men's voices. Deadly and thrilling, it was a message that set Alan into action. Rossland had been killed under a flag of truce, and even the men under Graham had something like respect for that symbol. He could expect no mercy, nothing now but the most terrible of vengeance at their hands, and as he dodged back from the window he cursed Sokwenna under his breath, even as he felt the relief of knowing he was not dead. Before a shot had been fired from outside he was up the ladder. In another moment he was bending over the huddled form of the old Eskimo. "Come below," he commanded. "We must be ready to leave through the cellar pit." His hand touched Sokwenna's face. It hesitated, groped in the darkness, and then grew still over the old warrior's heart. There was no tremor or beat of life in the aged beast. Sokwenna was dead. The guns of Graham's men opened fire again. Volley after volley crashed into the cabin as Alan descended the ladder. He could hear bullets tearing through the chinks and windows as he turned quickly to the shelter of the pit. He was amazed to find that Mary Standish had returned and was waiting for him there. End of chapter 25. Recording by Roger Moline.
Chapter 26 of The Alaskan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Alaskan by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 26. In the astonishment with which Mary's unexpected presence confused him for a moment, Alan stood at the edge of the trap, staring down at her pale face, heedless of the terrific gunfire that was assailing the cabin. That she had not gone with Keok and Nawadlook, but had come back to him, filled him with instant dread, for the precious minutes he had fought for were lost, and the priceless time gained during the parley with Rossland counted for nothing. She saw his disappointment and his danger, and sprang up to seize his hand and pull him down beside her. "Of course you didn't expect me to go," she said in a voice that no longer trembled or betrayed excitement. "You didn't want me to be a coward. My place is with you." He could make no answer to that, with her beautiful eyes looking at him as they were, but he felt his heart grow warmer and something rise up chokingly in his throat. "Sokwenna is dead, and Rossland lies out there, shot under a flag of truce," he said. "We can't have many minutes left to us." He was looking at the square of light where the tunnel from the cellar pit opened into the ravine. He had planned to escape through it alone and keep up a fight in the open, but with Maire at his side it would be a desperate gauntlet to run. "Where are Keok and Nawadlook?" he asked. "On the tundra, hurrying for the mountains. I told them it was your plan that I should return to you. When they doubted, I threatened to give myself up unless they did as I commanded them. And, Alan, the ravine is filled with the rain mist and dark." She was holding his free hand closely to her breast. "It is our one chance," he said. "And aren't you glad, a little glad, that I didn't run away without you?" Even then he saw the sweet and tremulous play of her lips as they smiled at him in the gloom, and heard the soft note in her voice that was almost playfully chiding, and the glory of her love as she had proved it to him there drew from him what he knew to be the truth. "Yes, I am glad. It is strange that I should be so happy in a moment like this. If they will give us a quarter of an hour." He led the way quickly to the square of light and was first to creep forth into the thick mist. It was scarcely rain, yet he could feel the wet particles of it, and through this saturated gloom whining bullets cut like knives over his head. The blazing cabin illumined the open on each side of Sokwenna's place, but deepened the shadows in the ravine, and a few seconds later they stood hand in hand in the blanket of fog that hid the coulee. Suddenly the shots grew scattering above them, then ceased entirely. This was not what Alan had hoped for. Graham's men, enraged and made desperate by Rossland's death, would rush the cabin immediately. Scarcely had the thought leaped into his mind when he heard swiftly approaching shouts, the trampling of feet, and then the battering of some heavy object at the barricaded door of Sokwenna's cabin. In another minute or two their escape would be discovered, and a horde of men would pour down into the ravine. Mary tugged at his hand. "Let us hurry up," she pleaded. What happened then seemed madness to the girl, for Alan turned and with her hand held tightly in his started up the side of the ravine, apparently in the face of their enemies. Her heart throbbed with sudden fear when their course came almost within the circle of light made by the burning cabin. Like shadows they sped into the deeper shelter of the corral buildings, and not until they paused there did she understand the significance of the hazardous chance they had taken. Already Graham's men were pouring into the ravine. "They won't suspect we've doubled on them until it's too late," said Alan exultantly. "We'll make for the kloof. Stampede and the herdsmen should arrive within a few hours, and when that happens—" A stifled moan interrupted him. Half a dozen paces away a crumpled figure lay huddled against one of the corral gates. "He's hurt," whispered Mary after a moment of silence. "I hope so," replied Alan pitilessly. "It will be unfortunate for us if he lives to tell his comrades we have passed this way." Something in his voice made the girl shiver. It was as if the vanishing point of mercy had been reached, and savages were at their backs. She heard the wounded man moan again as they stole through the deeper shadows of the corrals toward the niggerhead bottom. And then she noticed that the mist was no longer in her face. The sky was clearing. She could see Alan more clearly, and when they came to the narrow trail over which they had fled once before that night, it reached out ahead of them like a thin, dark ribbon. Scarcely had they reached this point when a rifle shot sounded not far behind. It was followed by a second and a third, and after that came a shout. It was not a loud shout. There was something strained and ghastly about it, and yet it came distinctly to them. "The wounded man," said Alan in a voice of dismay. "He is calling the others. I should have killed him." He traveled at a half trot, and the girl ran lightly at his side. All her courage and endurance had returned. She breathed easily and quickened her steps so that she was setting the pace for Alan. They passed along the crest of the ridge under which lay the willows and the pool, and at the end of this they paused to rest and listen. Trained to the varied night whisperings of the tundras, Alan's ears caught faint sounds which his companion did not hear. The wounded man had succeeded in giving his message, and pursuers were scattering over the plain behind them. "Can you run a little farther?" he asked. "Where?" He pointed, and she darted ahead of him, her dark hair streaming in a cloud that began to catch a faint luster of increasing light. Alan ran a little behind her. He was afraid of the light. Only gloom had saved them this night, and if the darkness of mist and fog and cloud gave way to clear twilight and the sun glow of approaching day before they reached the kloof, he would have to fight in the open. With Stampede at his side, he would have welcomed such an opportunity of matching rifles with their enemies, for there were many vantage points in the open tundra from which they might have defied assault. But the nearness of the girl frightened him. She, after all, was the hunted thing. He was only an incident. From him could be exacted nothing more than the price of death. He would be made to pay that, as Oquena had paid. For her remained the unspeakable horror of Graham's lust and passion. But if they could reach the kloof and the hiding place in the face of the cliff, they could laugh at Graham's pack of beasts while they waited for the swift vengeance that would come with Stampede and the herdsmen. He watched the sky. It was clearing steadily. Even the mists in the hollows were beginning to melt away, and in place of their dissolution came faintly rose-tinted lights. It was the hour of dawn. The sun sent a golden glow over the disintegrating curtain of gloom that still lay between it and the tundras, and objects 100 paces away no longer held shadow or illusionment. The girl did not pause, but continued to run lightly and with surprising speed, heeding only the direction which he gave her. Her endurance amazed him, and he knew that without questioning him she had guessed the truth of what lay behind them. Then all at once she stopped, swayed like a reed, and would have fallen if his arms had not caught her. "Splendid!" he cried. She lay gasping for breath, her face against his breast. Her heart was a swiftly beating little dynamo. They had gained the edge of a shallow ravine that reached within half a mile of the kloof. It was this shelter he had hoped for, and Maire's splendid courage had won it for them. He picked her up in his arms and carried her again, as he had carried her through the niggerhead bottom. Every minute, every foot of progress counted now. Range of vision was widening. Pools of sunlight were flecking the plains. In another quarter of an hour moving objects would be distinctly visible a mile away. With his precious burden in his arms, her lips so near that he could feel their breath, her heart throbbing, He became suddenly unconscious of the incongruity of the bird song that was wakening all about them. It seemed inconceivable that this day, glorious in its freshness and welcomed by the glad voice of all living things, should be a day of tragedy, of horror, and of impending doom for him. He wanted to shout out his protest and say that it was all a lie, and it seemed absurd that he should handicap himself with the weight and inconvenient bulk of his rifle when his arms wanted to hold only that softer treasure which they bore. In a little while Mary was traveling at his side again, and from then on he climbed at intervals to the higher swellings of the gully edge and scanned the tundra. Twice he saw men, and from their movements he concluded their enemies believed they were hidden somewhere on the tundra not far from the range houses. 3/4 of an hour later they came to the end of the shallow ravine, and 1/2 mile of level plain lay between them and the kloof. For a space they rested, and in this interval Mary smoothed her long hair and plaited it in 2 braids. In these moments Alan encouraged her, but he did not lie. He told her the 1/2 mile of tundra was their greatest hazard, and described the risks they would run. Carefully he explained what she was to do under certain circumstances. There was scarcely a chance they could cross it unobserved, but they might be so far ahead of the searchers that they could beat them out to the kloof. If enemies appeared between them and the kloof, it would be necessary to find a dip or shelter of rock and fight, and if pursuers from behind succeeded in outstripping them in the race, she was to continue in the direction of the kloof as fast as she could go, while he followed more slowly, holding Graham's men back with his rifle until she reached the edge of the gorge. After that he would come to her as swiftly as he could run. They started. Within 5 minutes they were on the floor of the tundra. About them in all directions stretched the sunlit plains. 1/2 mile back toward the range were moving figures, farther west were others, and eastward, almost at the edge of the ravine, were 2 men who would have discovered them in another moment if they had not descended into the hollow. Alan could see them kneeling to drink at the little coulée which ran through it. "Don't hurry," he said with a sudden swift thought. "Keep parallel with me and at distance away. They may not discover you are a woman, and possibly may think we are searchers like themselves. Stop when I stop. Follow my movements." "Yes, sir." Now in the sunlight she was not afraid. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright as stars as she nodded at him. Her face and hands were soiled with muck stain, her dress spotted and torn, and looking at her thus, Alan laughed and cried out softly, "You beautiful little vagabond." She sent the laugh back, a soft, sweet laugh to give him courage, and after that she watched him closely, falling in with his scheme so cleverly that her action was better than his own, and so they had made their way over 1/3 of the plain when Alan came toward her suddenly and cried, "Now run!" A glance showed her what was happening. The 2 men had come out of the ravine and were running toward them. Swift as a bird she was ahead of Alan, making for a pinnacle of rock which he had pointed out to her at the edge of the kloof. Close behind her he said, "Don't hesitate a second. Keep on going. When they are a little nearer I am going to kill them. But you mustn't stop." At intervals he looked behind him. The 2 men were gaining rapidly. He measured the time when less than 200 yards would separate them. Then he drew close to Mary's side. "See that level place ahead? We'll cross it in another minute or 2. When they come to it I'm going to stop, and catch them where they can't find shelter. But you must keep on going. I'll overtake you by the time you reach the edge of the kloof." She made no answer, but ran faster, and when they had passed the level space she heard his footsteps growing fainter, and her heart was ready to choke her when she knew the time had come for him to turn upon their enemies. But in her mind burned the low words of his command, his warning, and she did not look back, but kept her eyes on the pinnacle of rock which was now very near. She had almost reached it when the first shot came from behind her. Without making a sound that would alarm her, Alan had stumbled and made pretense of falling. He lay upon his face for a moment as if stunned, and then rose to his knees. An instant too late, Graham's men saw his ruse when his leveled rifle gleamed in the sunshine. The speed of their pursuit was their undoing. Trying to catch themselves so that they might use their rifles, or fling themselves upon the ground, they brought themselves into a brief but deadly interval of inaction. And in that flash one of the men went down under Alan's first shot. Before he could fire again, the second had flattened himself upon the earth, and swift as a fox, Alan was on his feet and racing for the kloof. Mary stood with her back against the huge rock, gasping for breath, when he joined her. A bullet sang over their heads with its angry menace. He did not return the fire, but drew the girl quickly behind the rock. "He won't dare to stand up until the others join him," he encouraged her. "We're beating them to it, little girl. If you can keep up a few minutes longer." She smiled at him, even as she struggled to regain her breath. It seemed to her there was no way of descending into the chaos of rock between the gloomy walls of the kloof, and she gave a little cry when Alan caught her by her hands and lowered her over the face of a ledge to a table-like escarpment below. He laughed at her fear when he dropped down beside her and held her close as they crept back under the shelving face of the cliff to a hidden path that led downward, with a yawning chasm at their side. The trail widened as they descended, and at the last they reached the bottom, with the gloom and shelter of a million-year-old crevasse hovering over them. Grim and monstrous rocks, black and slippery with age, lay about them, and among these they picked their way, while the trickle and drip of water and the flesh-like clamminess of the air sent a strange shiver of awe through Mary Standish. There was no life here, only an age-old whisper that seemed a part of death, and when voices came from above, where Graham's men were gathering, they were ghostly and far away. But here, too, was refuge and safety. Mary could feel it as they picked their way through the chill and gloom that lay in the silent passages between the gargantuan rocks. When her hands touched their naked sides, an uncontrollable impulse made her shrink closer to Alan, even though she sensed the protection of their presence. They were like colossi, carved by hands long dead, and now guarded by spirits whose voices guttered low and secretly in the mysterious drip and trickle of unseen water. This was the haunted place. In this chasm death and vengeance had glutted themselves long before she was born, and when a rock crashed behind them, accidentally sent down by one of the men above, a cry broke from her lips. She was frightened, and in a way she had never known before. It was not death she feared here, nor the horror from which she had escaped above, but something unknown and indescribable for which she would never be able to give a reason. She clung to Alan, and when at last the narrow fissure widened over their heads and light came down and softened their way, he saw that her face was deathly white. "We are almost there," he comforted, "and some day you will love this gloomy kloof as I love it, and we will travel it together all the way to the mountains." A few minutes later they came to an avalanche of broken sandstone that was heaped halfway up by the face of the precipitous wall, and up this climbed until they came to a level shelf of rock, and back of this was a great depression in the rock, 40 feet deep and half as wide, with a floor as level as a table and covered with soft white sand. Mary would never forget her first glimpse of this place. It was unreal, strange, as if a band of outlaw fairies had brought the white sand for a carpet, and had made this their hiding place, where wind and rain and snow could never blow. And up the face of the cavern, as if to make her thought more real, led a ragged fissure, which it seemed to her only fairies' feet could travel, and which ended at the level of the plain. So they were tundra fairies, coming down from flowers and sunlight through that fissure, and it was from the evil spirits in the kloof itself that they must have hidden themselves. Something in the humor and gentle thought of it all made her smile at Alan. But his face had turned suddenly grim, and she looked up the kloof where they had traveled through danger and come to safety, and then she saw that which froze all thought of fairies out of her heart. Men were coming through the chaos and upheaval of rock. There were many of them, appearing out of the darker neck of the gorge into the clearer light, and at their head was a man upon whom Mary's eyes fixed themselves in horror. White-faced she looked at Alan. He had guessed the truth. "That man in the front?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes." "Is John Graham?" He heard the words choking in her throat. "Yes, John Graham." He swung his rifle slowly, his eyes burning with a steely fire. "I think," he said, "that from here I can easily kill him." Her hand touched his arm. She was looking into his eyes. Fear had gone out of them, and in its place was a soft and gentle radiance, a prayer to him. "I am thinking of tomorrow, the next day, the years and years to come with you," she whispered. "Alan, you can't kill John Graham. Not until God shows us it is the only thing left for us to do. You can't." The crash of a rifle between the rock walls interrupted her. The snarl of a bullet followed the shot. She heard it strike, and her heart stopped beating, and the rigidity of death came into her limbs and body as she saw the swift and terrible change in the stricken face of the man she loved. He tried to smile at her, even as a red blot came where the streak of gray in his hair touched his forehead, and then he crumpled down at her feet, and his rifle rattled against the rocks. She knew it was death. Something seemed to burst in her head and fill her brain with the roar of a flood. She screamed. Even the men below hesitated, and their hearts jumped with a new sensation as the terrible cry of a woman rang between the rock walls of the chasm. And following the cry, a voice came down to them. "John Graham, I'm going to kill you. Kill you!" And snatching up the fallen rifle, Mary Standish set herself to the task of vengeance. End of chapter 26 of The Alaskan by James Oliver Curwood. Read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 27 of The Alaskan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Alaskan by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 27. She waited. The ferocity of a mother defending her young filled her soul, and she moaned in her grief and despair as the seconds passed. But she did not fire blindly, for she knew she must kill John Graham. The troublesome thing was a strange film that persisted in gathering before her eyes, something she tried to brush away, but which obstinately refused to go. She did not know she was sobbing as she looked over the rifle barrel. The figures came swiftly, but she had lost sight of John Graham. They reached the upheaval of shattered rock and began climbing it, and in her desire to make out the man she hated, she stood above the rampart that had sheltered her. The men looked alike, jumping and dodging like so many big tundra hares as they came nearer, and suddenly it occurred to her that all of them were John Graham's, and that she must kill swiftly and accurately. Only the hiding fairies might have guessed how her reason trembled and almost fell in those moments when she began firing. Certainly John Graham and his men did not, for her first shot was a lucky one, and a man slipped down among the rocks at the crack of it. After that she continued to fire until the responseless click of the hammer told her the gun was empty. The explosions and the shock against her slight shoulder cleared her vision and her brain. She saw the men still coming, and they were so near she could see their faces clearly, and again her soul cried out in its desire to kill John Graham. She turned, and for an instant fell upon her knees beside Alan. His face was hidden in his arms. Swiftly she tore his automatic from its holster and sprang back to a rock. There was no time to wait or choose now, for his murderers were almost upon her. With all her strength she tried to fire accurately, but Alan's big gun leaped and twisted in her hand as she poured its fire wildly down among the rocks until it was empty. Her own smaller weapon she had lost somewhere in the race to the kloof, and now when she found she had fired her last shot, she waited through another instant of horror until she was striking at faces that came within the reach of her arm. And then, like a monster created suddenly by an evil spirit, Graham was at her side. She had a moment's vision of his cruel, exultant face, his eyes blazing with a passion that was almost madness, his powerful body lunging upon her. Then his arms came about her. She could feel herself crushing inside them, and fought against their cruel pressure, then broke limply and hung a resistless weight against him. She wasn't unconscious, but her strength was gone, and if the arms had closed a little more they would have killed her. And she could hear clearly. She heard suddenly the shots that came from up the kloof, scattered shots, then many of them, and after that the strange, wild cries that only the Eskimo herdsmen make. Graham's arms relaxed. His eyes swept the fairy's hiding place with its white sand floor, and a fierce joy lit up his face. "Martens, it couldn't happen in a better place," he said to a man who stood near him. "Leave me 5 men. Take the others and help Schneider. If you don't clean them out, retreat this way, and 6 rifles from this ambuscade will do their business in a hurry." Mary heard the names of the men called who were to stay. The others hurried away. The firing in the kloof was steady now, but there were no cries, no shouts, nothing but the ominous crack of the rifles. Graham's arms closed about her again. Then he picked her up and carried her back into the cavern, and in a place where the rock walls sagged inward, making a pocket of gloom which was shut out from the light of day, he laid her upon the carpet of sand. Where the erosion of many centuries of dripping water had eaten its first step in the making of the ragged fissure, a fairy had begun to climb down from the edge of the tundra. He was a swift and agile fairy, very red in the face, breathing fast from hard running, but making not a sound as he came like a gopher where it seemed no living thing could find a hold. And the fairy was Stampede Smith. From the lips of the kloof he had seen the last few seconds of the tragedy below, and where death would have claimed him in a more reasonable moment, he came down in safety now. In his finger ends was the old tingling of years ago, and in his blood the thrill which he had thought was long dead, the thrill of looking over leveled guns into the eyes of other men. Time had rolled back, and he was the old Stampede Smith. He saw under him lust and passion and murder as in other days he had seen them. And between him and desire there was neither law nor conscience to bar the way, and his dream, a last great fight, was here to fill the final unwritten page of a life's drama that was almost closed. And what a fight! If he could make that carpet of soft white sand unheard and unseen. 6 to 1. 6 men with guns at their sides and rifles in their hands. What a glorious end it would be for a woman and Alan Holt. He blessed the firing up the kloof which kept the men's faces turned that way. He thanked God for the sound of combat, which made the scraping of rock and the rattle of stones under his feet unheard. He was almost down when a larger rock broke loose and fell to the ledge. 2 of the men turned, but in that same instant came a more thrilling interruption. A cry, a shrill scream, a woman's voice filled with madness and despair came from the depths of the cavern, and the 5 men stared in the direction of its agony. Close upon the cries came Mary Standish with Graham behind her, reaching out his hands for her. The girl's hair was flying, her face the color of white sand, and Graham's eyes were the eyes of a demon forgetful of all else but her. He caught her. The slim body crumpled in his arms again, while pitifully weak hands beat futilely in his face. And then came a cry such as no man had ever heard in Ghost Kloof before. It was Stampede Smith. A sheer 20 feet he had leaped to the carpet of sand, and as he jumped his hands whipped out his 2 guns, and scarcely had his feet touched the floor to the soft pocket in the ledge when death crashed from them, swift as lightning flashes, and 3 of the 5 were tottering or falling before the 2 others could draw or swing a rifle. Only one of them had fired a shot. The other went down as if legs had been knocked from under him by a club, and the one who fired bent forward then, as if making a bow to death, and pitched on his face. And then Stampede Smith whirled upon John Graham. During these few swift seconds Graham had stood stunned, with the girl crushed against his breast. He was behind her, sheltered by her body, her head protecting his heart, and as Stampede turned he was drawing a gun, his dark face blazing with the fiendish knowledge that the other could not shoot without killing the girl. The horror of the situation gripped Stampede. He saw Graham's pistol rise slowly and deliberately. He watched it, fascinated, and the look in Graham's face was the cold and unexcited triumph of a devil. Stampede saw only that face. It was 4 inches, perhaps 5, away from the girl's. There was only that, and the extending arm, the crooking finger, the black mouth of the automatic seeking his heart. And then, in that last second, straight into the girl's staring eyes blazed Stampede's gun, and the 4 inches of leering face behind her was suddenly blotted out. It was Stampede and not the girl who closed his eyes then, and when he opened them and saw Mary Standish sobbing over Alan's body, and Graham lying face down in the sand, he reverently raised the gun from which he had fired the last shot, and pressed its hot barrel to his thin lips. Then he went to Alan. He raised the limp head, while Mary bowed her face in her hands. In her anguish she prayed that she, too, might die, for in this hour of triumph over Graham there was no hope of joy for her. Alan was gone. Only death could have come with that terrible red blot on his forehead, just under the gray streak in his hair. And without him there was no longer a reason for her to live. She reached out her arms. "Give him to me," she whispered. "Give him to me." Through the agony that burned in her eyes, she did not see the look in Stampede's face, but she heard his voice. "It wasn't a bullet that hit him," Stampede was saying. "The bullet hit a rock, and it was a chip from the rock that caught him square between the eyes. He isn't dead, and he ain't going to die." How many weeks or months or years it was after his last memory of the fairies' hiding place before he came back to life, Alan could make no manner of guess. But he did know that for a long, long time he was riding through space on a soft white cloud, vainly trying to overtake a girl with streaming hair who fled on another cloud ahead of him. And at last this cloud broke up like a great cake of ice, and the girl plunged into the immeasurable depth over which they were sailing, and he leaped after her. Then came strange lights and darkness and sounds like the clashing of cymbals and voices, and after those things a long sleep, from which he opened his eyes to find himself in a bed, and a face very near, with shining eyes that looked at him through a sea of tears. And a voice whispered to him sweetly, softly, joyously, "Alan." He tried to reach up his arms. The face came nearer. It was pressed against his own. Soft arms crept about him. Softer lips kissed his mouth and eyes, and sobbing whispers came with their love. And he knew the end of the race had come, and he had won. This was the 5th day after the fight in the kloof, and on the 6th he sat up in his bed, bolstered with pillows, and Stampede came to see him, and then Keok and Nawadlook and Tatpan and Topkok and Vegarok, his old housekeeper, and only for a few minutes at a time was Mary away from him. But Tautuk and Amuk Toolik did not come, and he saw the strange change in Keok and knew that they were dead. Yet he dreaded to ask the question, for more than any others of his people did he love these two missing comrades of the tundras. It was Stampede who first told him in detail what had happened, but he would say little of the fight on the edge, and it was Mary who told him of that. "Graham had over 30 men with him, and only 10 got away," he said. "We have buried 16 and are caring for 7 wounded at the corrals. Now that Graham is dead, they're frightened stiff, afraid we're going to hand them over to the law. And without Graham or Rossland to fight for them, they know they're lost." "And our men, my people?" asked Alan faintly. "Fought like devils. Yes, I know, but—" "They didn't rest an hour in coming from the mountains." "You know what I mean, Stampede." "Not many, Alan. 7 were killed, including Sokwenna," and he counted over the names of the slain. Tautuk and Amuk Toolik were not among them. "And Tautuk?" "He is wounded. Missed death by an inch, and it has almost killed Keok. She is with him night and day, and as jealous as a little cat if anyone else attempts to do anything for him." "Then I'm glad Tautuk was hit," smiled Alan. And he asked, "Where is Amuk Toolik?" Stampede hung his head and blushed like a boy. "You'll have to ask her, Alan." And a little later Alan put the question to Mary. She too blushed, and in her eyes was a mysterious radiance that puzzled him. "You must wait," she said. Beyond that she would say no word, though he pulled her head down and with his hands in her soft smooth hair threatened to hold her until she told him the secret. Her answer was a satisfied little sigh, and she nestled her pink face against his neck and whispered that she was content to accept the punishment. So where Amuk Toolik had gone and what he was doing still remained a mystery. A little later he knew he had guessed the truth. "I don't need a doctor," he said, "but it was mighty thoughtful of you to send Amuk Toolik for one." Then he caught himself suddenly. "What a senseless fool I am! Of course there are others who need a doctor more than I do." Mary nodded. "But I was thinking chiefly of you when I sent Amuk Toolik to Tanana. He is riding Kauk and should return almost any time now." And she turned her face away so that he could see only the pink tip of her ear. "Very soon I will be on my feet and ready for travel," he said. "Then we will start for the States as we planned." "You will have to go alone, Alan, for I shall be too busy fitting up the new house," she replied in such a quiet, composed little voice that he was stunned. "I've already given orders for the cutting of timber in the foothills, and Stampede and Amuk Toolik will begin construction very soon. I'm sorry you find your business in the States so important, Alan. It will be a little lonesome with you away." He gasped. "Mary!" She did not turn. "Mary!" He could see again that little heart-like throb in her throat when she faced him. And then he learned the secret, softly whispered with sweet, warm lips pressed to his. "It wasn't a doctor I sent for, Alan. It was a minister. We need one to marry Stampede and Nawadlook and Tautuk and Keok. Of course, you and I can wait." But she never finished, for her lips were smothered with a love that brought a little sob of joy from her heart. And then she whispered things to him which he had never guessed of Mary Standish, and never quite hoped to hear. She was a little wild, a little reckless, it may be, but what she said filled him with a happiness which he believed had never come to any other man in the world. It was not her desire to return to the States at all. She never wanted to return. She wanted nothing down there, nothing that the Standish fortune builders had left her, unless he could find some way of using it for the good of Alaska. And even then she was afraid it might lead to the breaking of her dream. For there was only one thing that would make her happy, and that was his world. She wanted it just as it was, the big tundras, his people, the herds, the mountains, with the glory and greatness of God all about them in the open spaces. She now understood what he had meant when he said he was an Alaskan and not an American. She was that too, an Alaskan first of all. And for Alaska she would go on fighting with him, hand in hand, until the very end. His heart throbbed until it seemed it would break, and all the time she was whispering her hopes and secrets to him he stroked her silken hair until it lay spread over his breast and against his lips, and for the first time in years a hot flood of tears filled his eyes. So happiness came to them, and only strange voices outside raised Mary's head from where it lay, and took her quickly to the window where she stood, a vision of sweet loveliness, radiant in the tumbled confusion and glory of her hair. Then she turned with a little cry, and her eyes were shining like stars as she looked at Alan. "It is Amuk Toolik," she said. "He has returned." "And is he alone?" Alan asked, and his heart stood still, while he waited for her answer. Demurely she came to his side and smoothed his pillow and stroked back his hair. "I must go and do up my hair, Alan," she said then. "It would never do for them to find me like this." And suddenly, in a moment, their fingers entwined and tightened, for on the roof of Sokwenna's cabin the little gray-cheeked thrush was singing again. End of chapter 27 and end of the book The Alaskan by James Oliver Curwood. Read by Lars Rolander.